Have you ever heard music so strange that it felt like it wasn't just entering your ears, but waking up something ancient inside you? Last time on Good Stories, we stood in an African village under a hot moon. We watched mahogany-skinned dancers move like living bronze, while tom-toms, rattles, and bamboo flutes crashed into a wild orchestra. A king shouted for more. Skeleton-painted dancers whirled like spirits from the graveyard, and a wandering violinist suddenly found himself knighted with a dead king's thigh bone. We followed him through kraals filled with skulls and laughter, through jungles where Ruru idols stared with glass eyes, and to funerals where drums and flies circled the same wooden coffin. At night, the African moon rose, the faces of the idols crept from the trees, and the jungle itself seemed to whisper, "Englishman, go home before you are dead." In Part 6, we keep walking beside that restless traveler. But now the question becomes sharper. Is he just exploring foreign lands, or is he chasing something he can never quite catch home, meaning, or simply the right to keep dreaming? Stay with this episode, because before the story ends, Africa will reveal far more than drums and ghosts. It will show us what it really means to be alive. And now, please listen to Part 6 of the story of Vagabond's Odyssey. When I got back to Sierra Leone, I was glad of a rest and stayed at the English hotel for a couple of weeks. At Freetown, I heard a Negro play the violin really well. He held the fiddle to his breast instead of to his chin and played Raff's Cavatina and La Serenata very expressively. I complimented him on his playing and discovered that a Hungarian violin player had given him a course of lessons. He played African dances and melodies wonderfully well. We had a glorious time, that Negro violinist and I. In an old bungalow by a native village where soldiers and white men congregated, we gave concerts night after night. The men came from far and near and joined in the sing-songs. Our small, extemporized orchestra played homeland songs. The exiles shouted themselves hoarse. We made up part songs and put our own words to them, and the natives came from the village and peeped into our bungalow with delighted eyes and ears as we scraped away. It was there that I wrote the melody that is now the trio of my military march, Sierra Leone. This is how it went in the original setting. A few years later, I made a military march trio of the strain and sold it to a London publisher. I heard it performed by Sousa's band at several commemoration festivals in New York City. I have heard many violinists, among them Joachim, whom I heard when I was a boy. While on a ship in the East India docks, I obtained leave from the skipper for a Saturday afternoon off, and full of excitement went to Sydenham and heard the great violinist perform at the Crystal Palace. To tell the truth, I was disappointed. He played a Vioti concerto, stood like a statue, and his fingers and arms moved with the ease of machinery. His bearded face was raised toward the ceiling the whole time, as though he saw some beautiful sight in the sky above the palace roof. It struck me as a very refined and intellectual-looking face. His playing revealed perfection in the trained artistic sense, but lacked the fire and emotion born of the singing stars. I heard Sarasate play at his villa near Biarritz. His nostrils dilated and pinched in as he played, and he had all that Joachim lacked when Joachim played in public, for he was a spiritual player. You could have thought that the angels were. Wailing and fingering his own heartstrings, Mbise played rather like Sarasate, but seemed more conscious of his own ability, which destroyed the atmosphere of the public performance, which I happened to hear. Kubelik I have heard twice, at Bournemouth and in New South Wales. He performed with Joachim's machinery like ease. His double stopping revealed the perfection of the performer's ear and the dexterity of the fingers that seemed to outdo the player's own heart. But it struck me as cold playing, as if the player's command over technique was greater than his musical temperament. I have often heard it said that the marvelous technique of Paganini is today the technical equipment of all violin virtuosos. I doubt it. Certainly they are not mentally equipped with his way of playing. When you look at Paganini's compositions, you see something that is the outcome of one personality, the white heat of genius who first discovered the musical gold mines in the depths of the violin. What must the man have been whose genius was so intense that he invented that which all others imitate and call their equipment? Paganini could not leave his playing to posterity, but a true critic can look at those individual compositions and dream of the tremendous passion that inspired the maestro to leave us those fugitive echoes of his playing, for that is all they are. Paganini played like an inspired, deep-feeling barbarian. His style was not artifice and did not represent, by artistic bowing and phrasing, the niceties of polite emotion, and the artistries of civilization. We have no compositions as he played them. He stood before his awestruck audience and extemporized melodies, chords, sparkling arpeggios, and staccato and cadenzas that were all half forgotten when the intense musical fury of his heart ceased. And the magic fingers were silent, and so we have only hints of his style. His imitators scrape out phonographic records of his published compositions and say they are equipped with Paganini's art. I heard an English violinist, Henley, in London. I was off to Jamaica next morning and only heard him by accident. A friend of mine said, "Come in this hall." We went in, and I was astonished. I thought at first that the violinist whom I saw playing, with Joachim's ease and Sarasate's passion, must be some foreigner, but he was an Englishman. His double stopping was superb, with a passionate fire in it alien to Kubelik's temperament, I should think. Altogether he was really the most artistic and passionate player I ever heard, Sarasate excepted. While he played, I realized that note that tells of genius, which makes you feel that the performer's violin and fingers are imperfect instruments, are not as great as the heart that is trying to express its depth of feeling upon strings. I went abroad after that. I have not heard since of Henley, the wonderful violinist. He was English, and I suppose London's fashionable musical world positively refused to go mad about an Englishman when so many German and Austrian violinists were about. I heard King Billy, the Australian Aboriginal king, play the violin by the curbside in Sydney. He was the world's worst great violinist, made a squeaking row, and thought more of the cash the colonials dropped in his tin pot than of the melody which he performed. An artistic public performance on the violin is widely divided from the poetry of violin playing in solitude, out of sheer love to express the performer's feelings and relieve the tension of sorrow and joy that is oppressing him. When I was a boy, staying at Leichhardt, in Sydney, I heard someone playing the violin and accompanying his playing with his own voice. The sound came from a little wooden house on a flat. I stood still and listened. It was dusk. On the window was a bit of scribbled paper, "Room to let, cheap." That gave me a good excuse, for I was intensely curious to see the man who played and sang so beautifully. I knocked at the door and was asked in, and I got in conversation with the player. He was a Norwegian with a handsome face, but unshaved and worried-looking. His wife was about 30 years older than he was, and as he played to me she sat near, and her old wrinkled face beamed with delight as I praised his playing. He played by ear and was self-taught. I could easily see that. But he was a great violinist. He expressed his very soul as he played, in a weird, peculiar style, Norwegian melodies. I felt greatly drawn toward him. He played and sang to me, looking past me with steady, dreaming eyes as he extemporized sweet strains. He had hard, rough hands through working on the roads. I saw him night after night. I thought at first that his wife was his mother, and I said, "Your son is a real musician," when he smiled at me and said, "My wife, not mother." I felt very uncomfortable. He took her old wrinkled hand and led her into the little kitchen and kissed her tenderly. I suppose Norwegian women age quickly, or they had fallen in love with each other when he was quite a lad. But it was beautiful to see their sincere, sweetheart-like affection for each other. He secured a job on the Broken Hill silver mines, packed up, and went off to Melbourne. I never saw him again. I often think of him and his clever, handsome face as he sat breathing heavily and playing and singing to me. He would have been better than Joachim and Kubelik if he had had their technical equipment and no road stones to break and ruin his hands. I cannot remember any special feelings when I heard the great violinists, Joachim, Kubelik and Chrysler, except curiosity and momentary admiration, but the memory of the stone-breaking Norwegians. Playing is as vivid today as then, and when I think of it, all the poetic atmosphere of his playing still haunts me. So if it's true that time is the great critic of poetry and music, then assuredly, as far as I'm concerned, my Norwegian friend was the greatest violinist I ever heard. It is difficult to define art. I suppose anything that appeals to the best emotions in men and women is art. A good deal of what is known as art today will soon be cast on the rubbish heap of the medieval ages with the old ideals and idols. People move in the realms of art as they do in frock coats. It must be just so, and must have 3 buttons on the front only. If it has 4 buttons, it's not art. Art should be natural and oblivious of fashion, and, like true religion, beautiful in rags and tatters, pale-faced, walking the streets of humanity, singing with the birds and stars, and looked down upon by affluence. Do the thousands who hear Wagner understand the depth and meaning of the music as Wagner thought they would understand? Do they hear the barbarian note in his music that tells so well of the savagery of the German people, the barbarian shriek, the exultation over the fallen, and the tramp of bloodthirsty warriors, driving the helpless victims of the fallen cities before them? I do not think so. It's fashionable, and to have heard Wagner is to be in the fashion, and so oft people go and hear and see Wagner. Most of them would more thoroughly understand and enjoy a phonographic record of a Solomon Islanders' cannibalistic dance, accompanied by living pictures of the scantily clad native men and women, beating their drums and whirling round the blushing bride, clad in half a coconut shell and her hair only. Their funerals are conducted with the same austere art that makes them all go and see Wagner. I like Beethoven and Mendelssohn's concertos, also Schubert's music, indeed all the really good classical compositions, but my memory of the old shanty, Blow the Man Down, as I heard it sung, and sang it myself, with crook-nosed old sailors, as we rounded Cape Horn, with seas crashing over the decks and the Flying Scud racing the moon, the old skipper on the poop shouting, muffled to the teeth in oilskins, his gray beard swinging sideways to the wind as the full-rigged ship dipped and rolled homeward bound, is something of music, singing, and haunting my soul. That will only die when my memory dies. I can still see the crew climbing aloft and along the yards, their shadows falling softly through the moonlit gray sails and yards on to the decks. Melodies from the sails aloft, gliding under the stars, still sing beautifully to me as I watch the sleeping sailors, far out at sea, in their tossing bunks. Then they stand by the galley door, with their mugs for the hot coffee, while the chief mate tramps away the night to and fro on the poop, humming soon we'll be in London town. Then, as I dream, the sails crumble in the moonlight, the decks are awash, sink, and disappear. Sailors are struggling in the moonlit waters. Their white hands are tossed up as they sink, one by one. And now daybreak steals over the skylines that fence that vast grave of wandering waters. Often memories play on the strings of my heart as I stand listening to the great orchestra of the winds, fingering the giant forest boughs, or to the noise of seas on the moonlit shores. I have been almost everything in my travels. Stowaway, sailor before the mast, bandmaster on a mail steamer, wet nurse to Samoan twins, 13 bushman, boundary rider, woodcutter, sundowner, post digger, snow sweeper in North America, painter, deckhand, shilling a monther in a liner's stokehold, messroom steward, native overseer, private grave digger, author, violinist to South Sea kings and chiefs, solo violinist and orchestral violinist in the large cities of the world, music teacher, songwriter, cornet player, composer of music for military bands, actor and singer, trader, canvasser for crank patents and medicine, banana planter in Jamaica, nut planter in the South Sea Islands, gold miner in Australia, violinist to geisha girls in Japan, and the leader of numerous splendid schemes that mostly failed. Glorious schemes they were, but you can never be sure of anything except that you will be certain to attend your own funeral. Their mother, a native woman, was drowned by the upsetting of a canoe. A Norwegian sailor, and I found the infants screaming in a hut on the coast. We secured a ripe coconut, and opening the eye hole in the shell, we placed it in turns at the mouths. They both tugged away and pressed the shell with their hands as though they were at the breast, and soon went off fast asleep. In the morning, we gave them into the charge of a native girl, who took them both away to the dead mother's relations. I have also been a poet. I wrote a little volume of Australian lyrics, which are all burnt now. I was so pleased with the first proofs that I put them on my bedroom mantelpiece, so that I could see them ere I slept, and directly I awoke at daybreak. The reviews in the newspapers and journals thrilled me. Full of sincerity, spirit, and impulse, marvelous descriptive ability, a real barbarian poet of the South Seas, I thought my fortune was made, and I could not sleep through thinking of coming. Fame and fortune. I thought surely such reviews in the newspapers will sell thousands of copies of my book, and I was very happy over my bright outlook. It was summertime. I became restless, and with the reviews in my pocket, I went off, walking very fast in my excitement. I soon arrived in the country at a beautiful spot. A windmill on the hilltop whirled its big black hands as though trying to catch the winged music of skylarks in the deep blue morning sky. By the lane side stood a cottage for sale. The very place for me, I thought. I will buy it and write there. What glorious poems of Australia and the South Seas they will be. The bird singing in a clump of firs just by my future front door rippled out notes, as though its little body would burst with joy. I took an old envelope from my pocket and started to write a lyric how happy I was, even the lyric was good. A month later I wrote to the publisher and said, "Dear sir, will you kindly send me a check in settlement for copies of my Australian lyric sold? I would not trouble you before the quarter, but unexpected calls on my purse have arrived at an inopportune moment." 2 weeks later I received this reply. "Dear sir, in reply to yours of the 16th, no copies of your book have been sold, and we would call your kind attention to balance of £2, 10s, overdue for binding, and £1, 18s, for corrections in proof, etc., and 9 south, for D, for postage and sending out review copies." So ended my volume of poetry, though I must add that the publisher turned out a good sort. I would sooner deal with publishers, some of them, than with stokehold bosses and concert managers. Music and book publishers cannot publish authors' inspirations that do not sell and keep the author as well. I wish they could. As for the reviewers of my poetry, they made me feel the happiest of aspirants for 4 weeks, and I feel grateful for that for weeks of greatness. I think it was after a voyage to the Cape that I stayed in London for a week, and then secured a berth on board the S.S. Port Adelaide, a tramp steamer. We called at Las Palmas, and then went slap bang across the world for Sydney. It was a monotonous voyage. We had a stowaway on board. They sent him down into the stokehold. He had been a London street Arab and street singer, was a jolly youth, and sang "The ivy and the myrtle were in bloom." Then he came round with the hat and got tobacco from the amused crew. The sailors encouraged him to tell his experiences and were delighted to hear how he carried parcels for passengers at the railway stations and often bolted with the parcel if it looked valuable. He would finish and then take his tin whistle out and blow it, do a jig, and sing some mournful street prayer. We had very bad weather after rounding the Cape, running the Easter down. There were 4 passengers on board, and 1 died of consumption. He lay on the hatchway for 2 days and nights. The weather was so bad that we couldn't stop the ship and decently bury it. He was canvassed up and weighted with lead, and seas came over the body all night long. We crept by it on deck like frightened shadows. When it was calmer, the captain said the burial service, and then all the crew, standing round the tide canvas length, said "Amen." Then gently, with the chief mate, I pushed it forward into the grave of wandering waters and heard the awful plomp as it touched the sea. At once the bell in the engine room rang full speed ahead. The engines started banging, and we were off again. About a week after that we sighted a full-rigged sailing ship bound for New Zealand, a Shaw Savile boat painted with white squares. She was doing about 12 knots and coming right across our bows. The mainmast was snapped off by the main yard, and 2 of the boats were gone. She had been through some terrible weather. She came dipping and rolling by, so close that as we looked over the side we saw the apprentices wave their hands. We all waved back as she passed by, dipping her flag to us, and we saluted back with ours. I felt a choky feeling as I watched her pass, with her broken spars and torn sails, flying away towards the mist of the sunset, the figurehead with hands stretched in prayer at the bows. The white-crested, curling waves lifted their arms and plucked at her sides as she went rolling and pitching by. There was something in the sight of that beaten ship that inspired me with more tenderness than anything I have ever seen at sea. I would often sit in the dim, oil-lit forecastle as we swayed and dipped along. The tiny round portholes lifted to the fall and rise of the bows, revealing the tossing blue moonlit seas outside. In that roaming home of merchant sailormen, at regular intervals, came the steady drawn, thundering music of the steamer's onward plunge as the screw urged her across the world. From the middle of the deck roof swung the oil lamp, its faint beams showing the outlines of the huddled sea chests on the deck floor and, all around, the narrow coffin-sized bunks wherein lay the sleeping or wakeful crew. Some snored, their bearded mouths wide open. Others smoked and made ribald remarks, as Jim English the boatswain, a typical sailor of the old school, yarned of long-ago voyages on windjammers. A real old shellback he was, and the only sailor whom I ever heard use the expressions "shiver my timbers." And avast there, I had voyaged in many sailing ships and tramp steamers, and mixed with many crews in foreign seaports, but never till then had I heard a living mouth utter those ancient nautical phrases so familiar to me in my old sea novels. "Stow your gab, Holy Moses, who the hell? Godlummy and Gorblummy were almost the only typical remarks in which sailors of my experience expressed their various moods. This old shellback, Jim English, was about 65 years of age and had sailed the seas before most of the crew were born. Sitting on his huge brown sea chest, he would half close his eyelids as I played. "Give us that again, matey." My old mother sang that to me when I was a nipper, he would say as I scraped some old melody out of the carpenter's cheap fiddle, and his thin, wrinkled lips smiled as though he dreamed pleasantly in sleep. I never tired of listening to his yarns as he sat and took bites from his tobacco plug, his kind gray eyes moving quickly as he brought his fist down with a crash to emphasize the main facts of his wonderful tales. At night, when the wind was blowing and you could only just see the outlined forms of the watch tramping to and fro on the bridge, he would sit and tell us eerie things, how he had seen the Phantom ship off the Cape on moonlight nights, dead shipmates climbing aloft among the gray sails, singing shanties. "Chummy," he would say, "my wife's been dead these 20 years, but often at night she sits on that old sack by my bunk there, looks at me in the old way, and says, 'Jim, keep off the booze. And don't make the round trip a dead horse, and never a drop have I touched these 10 years.' And the old girl comes with me and sits there and looks at me with her laughing gray eyes on every trip now." So earnest was he that our heads instinctively turned as we looked at the sack in the dark corner. We half expected to see his dead wife sitting there staring. He believed implicitly in dreams, for all the dire disasters of his life had been foretold in them. He was a kind of old priest of the sea. He wore an oilskin skull cap and looked upon all of us as mere children. And we felt like children as we listened to his advice and experiences. He had cures for all our ailments and was most superstitious. Once while he was yarning and sewing his socks, he put one of them on inside out. Suddenly discovering it, he whipped it off, then turned almost purple to the center of his bald head and said, "Now I've done it, mates. Some cursed thing's sure to happen before the trip's over. I've lost 4 shipmates overboard, and all through them putting their socks on inside out." As he said this, anguish wrinkled his sea-beaten face, and I too almost cursed the unfortunate mistake. The sailors shuffling cards at the folk's lee table looked over their shoulders through wreaths of tobacco smoke and wondered. As for me, I believed all he said. My awestruck eyes watched him as he yarned on and fed my imagination till I was a child again. His personality filled me with admiration. I almost worshipped him. I really think if he had mutinied and secured the old tramp steamer, I should have followed him as a son his father and thrown in my lot with him. Nor do I exaggerate in saying this, for his weird personality took me out of myself and away back. He refired the magic blaze, the still smoldering embers of my boyhood's romance, and I was romantic, almost to madness, as a boy. Old bearded heroes with unflinching eyes stared through my memories and fell, striking that last brave blow for right. Beautiful women, running by the magic moonlit sea foams of undiscovered shores, stretched their arms seaward as the wooden galleons with reefed topsails stood inland for the shore. Forlorn, love-lit eyes shone like stars through the dead sunsets on the skylines of vanished yesterdays, till I heard the windy poplar trees wailing in the lanes outside my bedroom window and the robin singing on the leafless apple tree. Once more the stolen candle shone, and the light never seen on sea or land blazed through my eyes as I traveled across magic seas and enchanted distant lands. Lands peopled with warriors and the beautiful creations of the torn novel by my bedside. That old sea priest loved hymns. He was truly religious and often sat turning the leaves of his well-fingered Bible. "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide" was a favorite hymn of his. I think I must have played it to him 100 times, so that now the melody to me suggests ships far out at sea, and the old shellback, whom I loved, used to sit on his sea chest telling us boys of the wooden ships that went down the seas and came back from other lands laden with scented cargoes, and that have faded away into the romantic dreams of this generation. The remainder of the crew were a mixed lot, not very different from the usual run of sailors on tramp steamers. They were quiet men, and had little to do with the firemen and trimmers who inhabited that half-folksly that was portioned off for them. I remember one of them was a shilling-a-monther, working his passage to the colonies for his health. He was a fine, broad-chested fellow, but in consumption, and whenever he was off duty, he seemed to be busy rubbing his chest with oils. He had quite a dozen bottles at the foot of his bunk, which he had purchased in London from quacks. Each bottle held oil that was a certain cure for consumption. We were very friendly with each other. I often helped him and, following his instructions, rubbed his back with the oils till the flesh was red. His little hacking cough would disappear for several days, and he would be quite cheerful. Then the cough would return and blood-spitting follow, and I felt very sorry for him, especially as, when he felt better, he would hit his chest with his fist and show me that he was at last cured. Playing cards or dominoes, sleeping and smoking were the usual excitements of the crew. On duty, they washed the decks down with the hose, tramped their watches, rolled ropes, cleaned brasswork, and followed the most monotonous life under the sun. After rounding the Cape to run the Easter down, they became busy with the sails, which helped the engines, when the wind was fair, to urge the vessel on the lonely voyage. A trip across the world on a sailing ship is very different from a voyage on a tramp steamer. She rides the waves and seeks the winds, and like a mammoth bird thing, with men singing shanties climbing along the bones of her spread wings, she races the clouds that fly overhead, and seems to sway the moon, stars or sun, as she rolls and pitches along. The crews of sailing ships, when I was a boy, were a different type of men from the crews of tramp boats. They were real sailors, or young fellows who had taken to sea life to learn to be sailors. A few of the old-time men among them, with their weather-beaten faces and old seaways, gave that atmosphere to the forecastle that has now gone forever. It must have been the romantic dreamer's paradise to go down to the sea in sailing ships before the world was worldly. I can imagine those old sailors, uneducated and superstitious, on the great ocean waters, watching the skylines and the dying sunsets as they dreamed of undiscovered shores. Or by night on deck fancied, they could hear the breakers beating against the starlit skyline where loomed the shores of eternity. Time and science have swept all that away from the sea forever. Today, the seaman stands on the deck and thinks of the latest trade union grievance. The ways of the ocean no longer suggest eternity behind the stars or undiscovered lands afar inhabited by strange peoples. To him, the ocean tracks are simply the main highways to New York, London, and the colonial cities, and to ports that are like railway stations of the high seas. Passengers get off at Suez, Colombo, Sydney, or Apia and catch the next boat or train as the quartermaster shouts, "All aboard!" Make haste, ladies and gentlemen. Rich puffing ladies and gentlemen with their daughters reship with their touring luggage for the next port, and they drag their deck chairs and pet poodles behind them. Old-time romance of thought has hardened and petrified into our stone-carved, gray terrace cities. But the blue horizons of dreams sparkle on forever. Yet withal, I have enjoyed two blessings in life. One is to have been born civilized, for I have never wanted to hurt a man or do anything really outrageous. The other is to have been born in civilized times that have enabled me to wander the world unarmed and safe. To have sniffed the tropical wines, seas and flowers of far-off countries, and gazed across primeval plains or on the mountain peaks of lonely isles. To have heard the mighty silence of vast forests and peered into the eyes of semi-savage peoples. The cook of that tramp steamer was a strange old seaman who drank gin and seldom spoke. He had a gnarled, stolid-looking face and expressionless eyes, very deep-set. The green and flower of his youth had left him forever. Not a sentimental leaf or faded flower lingered in his memory. He reminded me of the mummified, blackened face of an old native I saw once, who still stood erect, just as he had died, in the hollow of a huge tree trunk in a forest of New Caledonia. A tree wherein he had taken shelter just before it was struck by lightning. Heat had blistered the dead face till it resembled gnarled bark. There was still a glassy gleam deep in the eye sockets, for though the eyes had gone, ants had eaten the back of the head away, and so light crept through from behind, where there was a small decayed hole in the tree trunk. It was very faint though, and as I stood a little way off, that awful facial expression reminded me of some hideous living mortal, whose soul slept, mole-like, in the cold, winter sleep of age, dead, yet still alive long after the real owner had committed suicide by strangling all his passions. It is strange how such sights impress us and cling to our memory, for we meet dead men daily, whose faculties are fungus growths. We see their moving lips, shake their dead hands, and wonder on the stony expression of their eyes, eyes that have not even the light of heaven behind them, as it lit up that Caledonia mummy's eye sockets. Our captain was a naval reserve man who carried himself with incurable haughtiness. He saw life's great drama and the light of creation only by being awestruck at himself and measuring all vastness from the solace of his feet to the crown of his head. The chief engineer was a jolly Scotsman who tipped the convivial chief steward and so always had a bottle of whiskey under his bunk. When he was half seas over he sang ye banks and braes, and will ye no come back again? As the engines thumped and the tramp steamer rolled and pitched along the highway of the world. We ran into terrifically bad weather, and with the sails set, for the wind was fair, the old engines crashed away as she pitched and the screw blades bobbed up behind. I have never followed the sea directly as a profession, but I have lived and communed with the hearts of sailors, held their hands in warm comradeship, as well as shared their hardships at sea and ashore. And so I have read them, as they cannot read the sea or themselves. To the majority of sailors, to have been to sea, say for 20 years, simply means to them, I've been to sea for 20 years, and means nothing more. To have been able to go to sea mentally, as well as physically, and to have been thrilled by the wild poetry of the wind songs and the romance of the sea, is to be in a strong sense a sailor of sailors. While the average sailor can still chew tobacco and tell you the names of ropes, women and grog shanties in distant seaports, I cannot even chew tobacco. But I can sit in my little room and watch the thundering seas tossing by my bedside, ablaze with the true light of sea romance, while sailing ships, with their crews aloft singing shanties full of joy, pass and repass through my bedroom door, outbound for the seaports of the world. About a week later, the albatross that sailed the winds, with restless eyes behind us night and day wheeled round and put out for the open sea, for we were nearing the coast of Australia. I went ashore in Adelaide and got to shillings worth of tomatoes for a treat. The man on the wharf helped my chum carry them. They gave me half a hundredweight for 2 shillings. Adelaide is a real old colonial seaboard town. I bought a good violin there and a lot of strings. We left next day for Melbourne, and I played the violin the whole way. In Melbourne the stowaway bolted, and the donkeyman swore all the way to Sydney, for the careful London Arab started life in the new land with his go-ashore boots and shirts, as well as taking, in case of emergency, about 40 plugs of the crew's allowance tobacco. We did not feel sorry for the stowaway in his venture in a new life. He had the annexing instincts of the old British stock, and we all felt he would do well in Australia. I very seldom made a round trip, and so, bidding the old bosun goodbye, after taking him ashore to hear him mutter for the last time shiver my timbers, I left the ship. I stayed in Sydney for a few weeks and finally got on a Japanese ship, the Maru, and eventually arrived at Yokohama. I had never been to Japan before, and after tea I hurried ashore. On the wharf stood rows of Japanese low-caste women, dressed like guys. They had black teeth and faces that looked as though they were carved out of yellow wood, and voices that went honk-ki-hong-ki-kokuko, as though they had an orange in their throats. Their toes turned inward and their eyes outward, and Japanese flies built their hives in their thick, matted hair. It was hot, muggy weather. I was very disappointed at first, but when I got up into the city and found myself walking among crowds of fascinating Japanese people, all jabbering and shuffling along in clogs, I became interested. I had some dim expectation of seeing bamboo dwellings and oriental fairyland trees with Japanese lanterns hanging on them. Instead of which I saw fine buildings, well-lit streets, and beautiful parks with lakes in them, surrounded by maple and cherry trees. Boats were being paddled on the lake by Japanese girls dressed in pale blue kimonos and with hibiscus and cherry blossom in their hair. You can never forget that you are in Japan because of the strange language that hums in your ears as you pass along, dreaming you hear the sandaled, shuffling feet of some old ghostly Assyrian city, and the hubbub of the population talking across the silent ages. Next day I went to Tokyo. It was only a few miles away, about 20, I think. There I saw real old Japan, and went off into the Oriental Dark Ages. I saw painted, red-lipped beauties with slit-shaped dark eyes and faces like dolls, being carried in sedan chairs in copper lid-shaped hats. Fanning themselves, they passed by and were carried to the palm house and down corridors to their mats. I made the acquaintance of a Japanese sailor. He was a genuine fellow and took a lot of trouble to satisfy my curiosity. I was introduced to his family. They lived at Soraka, if I remember the name aright. I went into their house, a wicker bungalow, and was greeted with, "Oh hey oh." 14 daughters in kimonos, pink and orange yellow, waited on me, bowing and curtsying in Eastern style. The old mother was intelligent looking. She had a face like a South Sea idol, with kind, dove-like eyes. The room was covered with soft mats, and the walls, of matted panels, were carved with oriental designs. I felt exceedingly happy as I sat by the oriental maidens and ate savory rice and fowl and drank sake. The daughters screamed with laughter as I used chopsticks instead of the fork which they gave me. I slept there that night and went with the family next day to see the sights, among them the Asakusa Temple, where they worship the goddess Kwannon. Beautiful green land surrounded the oriental city. Sarawana, my Japanese sailor sister, shuffled beside me, chatting away in Japanese as hard as her tongue could go, and pointing to the cherry and plum trees in full bloom. The quaint old mother and the others came on behind. They think a great deal of their cherry and plum trees, but as I gazed at them I thought of dear old England. I did not hear the blackbird singing in those cherry trees. I only saw large crimson butterflies flitting over the boughs, and, on the fair slopes, strange bamboo-fenced bungalows, instead of the country cottages and smoking chimneys of Kent. They enticed me to a tea-room festival, where I had a large bowl of tea, the national beverage. I sat cross-legged on a little mat by Sarawana, whose bright eyes sparkled and whose red lips often parted in a cheery laugh, revealing her pearly teeth. Geisha girls played samisens and biwas and danced in oriental curves round us. They were mostly pretty maidens, with small white teeth and eyes that peeped beneath their penciled brows like the frightened eyes of squirrels. They had beautiful hair too, with a bit of the national cherry blossom stuck into it. As they sang and strummed on their stringed, lyre-like instruments, they seemed perfectly oblivious of all around them. Their oblique eyes seemed to gaze on something miles away. Sarawana had been a geisha girl and played for her living as I had, and so we became comrades. Next day I took her and her sister down by the river. It was a beautiful spot. The banks were smothered with cherry and plum trees, camphor woods, and bamboos. "Why are you so sad, Sarawana?" I said as I sat by her side. Her sister sat with a Japanese lad among the bamboos just by. "Me lighti samaro, and he dead," and then she sang a little Japanese song, after wiping her eyes with the big sleeve of her blue kimono. We were quite alone. Only the little yellow birds twittered in the plum boughs overhead. "What does that song mean, Sarawana?" I said, and then she told me, in pidgin English, its meaning. "Unblown the cherry blossom blooms, are hid in the cold of dead lips, weeping to blossom, and crescent moons of coming springs are pale forever in thine eyes, O my love. Kwannon sits on her throne, Samaro, pale as chrysanthemums waiting thee, as camphor trees sigh over thy grave, O my Samaro." Did you love him much, Sarawana? Me lie tea him, as the birds the boughs. The river cry of him, O my Samaro. Then I tried to comfort her, laugh and be happy, and come on the river in a pleasure junk, for as I spoke a Japanese boatman beckoned us, laid his rowing poles down, and started to bargain with me. Then Sarawana answered, "Me lie tea you geisha girl want be app little while." "Of course," I replied, and then she said, "Samaro dead, but he know me goody and white man know he too." Then she lifted her pale blue kimono and revealed her tiny, clogged feet and ankles as she stepped into the junk. And by my side, singing melody and words that I could not understand, she went down the river. I thoroughly enjoyed myself, sympathized with the sad little geisha girl, and admired her modesty and poetic tenderness for the dead youth that she loved. I saw many geisha girls and Japanese women of all classes, but they were not all like Sarawana, and so I tell you of her. Japanese men and women are very much like the white races. Just one difference marks their characters with a ray of spiritual light. The girls, boys, women, and men of Japan are poetic. Everything about them is a symbol. A butterfly sat on Sarawana's hand. It was a kiss of her dead lover, and when it flew away, it went back to his grave to kiss the flowers and make him happy. The birds in the plum trees sing old love vows. Their wings fading in the sunset are the beautiful thoughts of the dead or the living flying home to heaven again. Japanese eyes shine with tears of joy as they think of those things at which English girls and boys would toss their heads back and scream with laughter. I did not return to my ship, but stayed at Tokyo till my money had all gone. For a while I stopped with my Japanese sailor friend. He was a generous fellow and invited me to stay with him and his people as long as I wished. I taught Sarawana to play some easy melodies on my violin, and I was surprised at the quick way she picked up fiddle playing. She taught me to play 1 or 2 Japanese tunes, and I sat outside her bamboo bungalow and played as she sang, and the cherry blossoms dropped on us from the branches overhead. I will not tell you all my experiences at Tokyo, but I made a bold bid to get a living out of my violin and secured several good pupils. A Japanese lady of note was one of them. She was connected with the Mikado's court and had relatives in Tokyo. She paid me well, and I made good headway with her, and she was exceedingly kind to me. I also had a few Englishwomen as pupils and went to Yokohama to give 2 of them lessons daily. Sarawana persuaded me to get up a kind of geisha orchestra. She played second fiddle and the cymbals. I ventured forth to a grand festival with my Japanese geisha troupe. When it became known that I was friendly with the geisha girls, I lost my best pupils, though there was no harm in anything that I did. Sarawana's mother was pleased with our venture and was delighted when she saw her daughters dressed up in brilliant kimonos and decked out in sashes of rich yellow and blue, with red flowers in their hair. I thought more of the novelty of it than I did of the money I might make. How romantic it all seemed as we marched along, laughing, under the white-blossomed cherry trees in far-off Japan. I did not know that professors and teachers of English ladies should not go about with geisha girls. However, I enjoyed myself, and my memory of Sarawana and Tins, her sister, as I called her, and her geisha friends is sweeter to me than the memory of those pupils I lost. My geisha troupe failed, and I secured an engagement as violinist at a missionary hall. Sarawana and her family attended the meetings. I worked there for about 3 weeks and received a good salary. It was easy, but unmusical, work. I had to play the mission harmonium twice a day, on Sundays 3 times. The hall was always crammed with converts, old men, young men and girls, some of them dressed in Japanese costume and others in European. Some wore tall hats and white collars. They sang English hymns, though the words were translated into Japanese. The old men and women sang very much out of tune, but looked very earnest. Their wooden mouths opened and shut as I scraped away. The mission was conducted by English women missionaries, as well as by men. The Japanese women were very decent people, and when I left, they made a collection for me and handed me quite a considerable sum. I composed a hymn and dedicated it to the society, but whether they ever published it or not I do not know. They said they would. When I bade my Japanese friends goodbye, they seemed sorry to see me go, especially Sarawana and my sailor comrade. He had a wooden-looking face that smiled eternally, like a carved idol. When he was fast asleep on his mat beside me, he still smiled. And so he was a good comrade, for I was subject to fits of depression, and when the little Japanese maid would play her lament and sing of her dead lover, I used to wish she was not so faithful. I was then about 22 years of age, and had seen much of the world. Very often I would lie awake for hours thinking of things that should have happened, considering the great faith I had in them. I sometimes thought of going back to England and settling down as a violinist, but then the thought of my country's terrible decorum quashed my longing. I had been a good deal in Queensland and had several good friends there. Sad memories, too, of a bush girl's grave by the swamp oak gullies. Sometimes I longed for Australian bush scenes as a lad longs for his own country. I had been to Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Brisbane several times since I first saw them, but things even in one short absence were rapidly changing. As the ships came in crammed with emigrants from all parts of the world, the surrounding bushland of the seaboard cities and towns was cut down, and up went thousands of wooden houses. And so old spots disappeared with the bushland which the Australian hates. If you say to a colonial I have been across hundreds of miles of your bushland with my swag, camping out, he hangs his head with shame, blushes, and says, I know, but we hope soon to cut it all down. I suppose you've seen our towns. There is no doubt about it, the majority of Australians born are ashamed of the wild bushlands and love the streets and spires and walls of bricks and mortar. Up country, it's all emigrant Englishmen and a few Australians who were born there and so could not help themselves. As for me, I love the bush and my memories of the bush, and when I went to the old spots and saw a wooden homestead standing on the slopes where I camped by my bush fire, I felt sad about it. Even world-weary and old as I looked across the few years and saw the hollows and far-off forest trees waving in the moonlight dusk for miles and miles along the shores of my memory. So I began to think of Australia again as I lay in bed at the Grand Hotel, Yokohama, and dreamt of my old days there. I could not go back to Tokyo, at least anywhere near the mission folk, for I had told them I was going straight back to England. I had really intended doing so, but I thought I could get a berth on a ship and save my few pounds instead of paying for my passage. In the end, I was left almost penniless and stranded in Yokohama. I lodged for a while at a European's house. He had married a Japanese woman and kept a kind of sailor's lodging home. I had some strange companions in my rooms. I think they were Muslim, Buddhist, and Brahmin men. They were fierce-looking fellows, wore white turbans, and had swarthy faces with curly, close-cropped beards. They knelt on little mats and prayed and chanted day and night. I found out after that one or two of them were Muhammadans. Their ancient-looking faces wore an Omar Khayyam-like expression. From them I heard about Astoreth and Osiris, Allah, Muhammad, and a lot more about Oriental and Eastern creeds. I noticed that they were all very earnest in their prayers, and when I walked suddenly into my room to fetch my violin one evening, two of them were kneeling in prayer at the window, worshipping the sunset. They never turned a hair at my interruption, but went on pouring forth solemn, strange words to the dying fires of Japan's horizon. It seemed to me then, and now, that all the so-called creeds were but one vast monotheistic cry in various dialects, each creed a different expression only. All of them instruments in the vast orchestra of life's drama, playing for the same end universal, hopeful harmony. The stars vary in magnitude and position, but they are all singing the same earnest melody. For they too are finite, and sing on as those strange men did in the Japanese doss house at Yokohama. I strolled along the wharfs at Yokohama Harbor with a young English sailor, whom I met at the lodging home. We were both extremely hard up. Alongside the wharf lay the S.S. Port Pirie, and we resolved to make a dash for it and stow away. She was due to leave at sunset. The funnel was belching forth smoke. The sailors were standing with their friends on deck. With my violin in my hand, I walked straight up the gangway, my comrade just behind me. I was well dressed, and the quartermaster bowed as I slipped on deck and asked to see the skipper. "He's in his cabin, I think." "Sir, all right," I said, and beckoning my friend as though he were my valet. I walked across the deck and along the starboard alleyway. We stood by the stokehold entrance and waited our chance. The hatchway to the coal bunkers was open. "Now," I said. In a moment we had taken the final plunge and disappeared in the ship's bowels. Scrambling across the coal, we huddled close together and waited. It seemed ages before she went, and then we heard the rattling, rusty chain of the anchor coming up and the throb of the winches, and the engine started. We were off. My dear old comrade beside me, breathing in the darkness, was worth his weight in gold. "We're off now, Jack," I said, and he answered, "God knows where to, I don't," and laughed. We had some boiled eggs and a cooked fowl, so we ate something and then slept. When we awoke, the boat was rolling heavily. It was dark, though possibly daylight up on deck. I curled up by my chum and slept again. 3 days after we emerged, starving and sweating, choked with coal dust and looking like two dissipated Negroes. The chief mate said hello, and we gave a grim smile as he said, "I shall have to take you fellows up to the skipper." Up we went and stood on the bridge. The skipper gazed at us through the hot sunshine for a moment sternly. No land in sight as the boat cut across the Pacific at 12 knots. "Put them in the stokehold," he said, and then turned on his heel and started tramping the bridge once more. By heavens! I was not built for stokehold work. For a week we shoveled coal and became like skeletons, sweating all our vigor away. Then I played the violin to the engineers, and their chief got the head steward to appeal for my services in the saloon. My comrade had to work still in the stokehold, but I took care that he had good food. I commandeered tins of stewed Californian pears and meat and built his strength up. He swallowed them down with coal dust and repaid me with grateful eyes. For out at sea with sailors, a fellowship exists that is almost unknown in the cities of the world. I suppose a ray of the illimitable gets into their brains. The vastness of the ocean, its endless skylines, and the ships appearing through them with singing sailors aloft, then passing away, just as stars pass singing something in the uncounted ages of God. These things unconsciously influence their souls, and they become children again, forgetting the respectability of civilization and feeling the humanity that makes men die for each other in the desert spaces and oceans of the world. Men slumbering in affluence and the tribal pride of some dubious ancestry often appear soulless. Suddenly stricken with some grief or poverty, they reveal something really decent in their natures, something that longed for recognition when the body waxed fat on food and pride in the barbarian deeds of their ancestors, deeds which done now would get the doer 10 years in Sing Sing or Wormwood Scrubs. There's nothing like living on hardtack in a tramp steamer's forecastle, or on crab apples in the Australian bush, or in cities by playing the violin to bring out the best or worst in men. Sorrow writes the true Bible of the universe and expresses all the poetry of existence. Though I have seen much of the world and had many downfalls, the atmosphere of my boyhood and its ideals remains. I still have deep faith in God's merciful providence, in the friendship of men, and in the earnest love of women. The old heroes of my dreaming boyhood still move with me as I travel on. The kindly eyes of earnest men and women shine through the mists of my memories and sweeten with light my dreaming existence. Not till I die will they die. I love to hear the laughter of children, their innocent voices, and little wails of grief expressed to me cries from the great heart of music, till I fancy I can see the flowers growing over their inevitable graves. In that feeling, I love all men and women, and those who have sinned have my unknown sympathy as well as my unknown love. Could I have my own way, I would lead a vast army to demolish the mighty cathedrals and churches of Europe, and to rob the wealth of the altars, selling the debris and giving the proceeds of the glorious battle in the cause of true religion to the thousands of starving little city children, providing covering for their tiny emaciated bodies. God would be my best friend in fighting for his helpless family and providing comfort for deserted women and fallen men. There is more true unselfish religion in saving a butterfly's life than in moaning for many years in a cathedral pew about your next lease of life. But to return to my travels and troubles. I well remember that stowaway trip. The boat was bound for Sydney. We had beautiful weather, and when I was a legitimate member of the crew, I did not regret my headlong dip into the stokehold. My comrade and I were treated well, and my violin brought me respect and applause when I played in the saloon concert. My fiddle has always been a dear friend and wailed passionately on my behalf when I have been in disgrace. I don't think I could find a more trustful and soulful companion if I started off to tramp the world again tomorrow. As we were flying through Sydney Heads, we received a message from the captain. He wanted to see my comrade and me on the bridge. He was an elderly, short-bearded man with kind eyes. "Well," he said, "I shall have to hand you two over to the authorities when we get in. Have you anything to say for yourselves?" "No, sir," I said, "only we are sorry for stowing away and wish to thank you for your kindness to us under such circumstances." He said and then stopped walking to and fro to say, "Have you got any money?" "Yes, sir," I said. "We'll go ashore and clear as soon as we get alongside. I'll let you off this time." We both thanked him, and half an hour after the chief mate came up to us and saying, "Here you are," handed us 10 shillings each. They do not always do that when you stow away, but that was my lucky experience. I can assure you that seafaring men are the bravest and kindest in the world. They know it and its ways by instinct. Whenever I hear of a captain going down with his ship, a lump comes up in my throat. Dear audience, the life you have just heard is messy, restless, and full of wrong turns. He has been almost everything, failed at almost everything, and yet he never truly lost the two things that mattered most, his curiosity and his heart. His book did not sell, his great schemes collapsed, ships rolled in storms, friends died, money vanished, but he kept moving, kept playing his violin, kept loving people that the world had already thrown away. The quiet truth behind all these adventures is this: a life is not measured only by success, titles, or safe choices. It is measured by how deeply we feel, how honestly we care, and how bravely we start again when plans fall apart. So if you are watching this and feel like a failure, or like your path is crooked and small, please remember this wanderer. Let yourself dream, even if your schemes do not work. Be kind, even when you are hurt. Protect the childlike part of you that still believes in friendship, beauty, and God, in whatever way you understand Him. The world may never know your name, but your soul will know whether you truly lived. My next trip took me to Bombay, where I stayed for a few days at the English Hotel by Fort Hill. The tropical scenery struck me as very similar to that which I had seen at Colombo, and the heat is terrific, though feathery tamarisks and palms shaded the tracks. The white population were waited on by the natives. My father was correspondent for the Indian Times, and my parents had lived in Bombay before I was born. They knew a great many people there. In my pocket, I had a letter from home. "If you go to Bombay, do go and see Mr. and Mrs. C. And whatever you do, dear, be well dressed. I had heard a lot about those great people when I was a schoolboy. So I did as I was bid and dressed up like a prince. When I arrived at the aristocratic, verandahed building, I carefully dusted my boots with my handkerchief and knocked. When the door opened and I gave my name to the native servants, an old man, the great C himself, came forward. He was polite to me, and I was the best-dressed man in the house, so I did not begrudge the money I had paid for the loan of the suit at the Bombay tailor's. Before I left Bombay, I went to see my little brother's grave, Gerald Massey S. Middleton. He was buried at Colaba Point, and I discovered his grave at last. A tamarisk tree was growing on it, and a few strange flowers. I felt the kinship of that little grave in a strange land. The earth did not hide from imagination's eyes the little dust beneath, which would have been my big brother if he had lived. I remembered my mother and father saying how they had felt when their ship went by Colaba Point, homeward bound for England, and they stood on deck and gazed inland and thought of their child being left behind. I knew how they must have felt as I stood there alone and gazed upon the little stone set between two large vaults. I felt intensely lonely. The Indian bees moaned in the flowers and palms. I saw my mother, a girl in years that day, standing weeping by her lost child. She still stood there in the sunset and shadow as I dreamed. I kissed her, picked a flower, and then walked away, the one solitary mourner that had come after many years, and probably the last. Next day I joined my ship and arrived in London 6 weeks later, only again to get a berth and go seaward, for the grim respectability of the city soon haunted me with its stony, nightmare eyes. The very atmosphere seemed to whisper, "Englishman, Englishman, are you respectable? Where's your Bible, your rent book, and your marriage certificate?" I seemed to hear that humming in my ears as I walked through London streets, miserably cold. I shivered and jumped into a cab at Waterloo and rushed off to Poplar. There was a man who lived there, in Abbott's Road, who was a crackhand at getting berths on the ships for us. In a week, I was off down Channel, on a Shaw Savile boat, bound for New Zealand and Australia, as happy as a swallow flying south. The music of the sails, bellowing out and flopping to rest, the rattling rigging, the sailors talking and singing on deck, made me feel intensely happy. And yet half miserable as I thought of the ship sailing across the world to a civilized port. I stood on deck wishing there were undiscovered shores where waves sang, never seen by human eyes, and dreaming of old pioneers and heroes of far-off ages. I seemed to realize at a very early age that the light of the universe, the sun and stars were my religion, and their mystery my unfathomable mistress with divine eyes. When the tramp steamer, after toiling along for weeks at sea, sighted land, I stood on her deck the longest, as the far-off shores shaped themselves, and fancied I could see the old wooden pioneer ships and galleons that discovered them still hugging the misty shore as sunset died. Often when far out at sea I would stand on the poop by night for hours, gazing astern, watching the star-like eyes of the albatrosses flitting on the restless winds, till they seemed old heroes, my comrades out of their graves, on beautiful wings, following the new ships. Then the mate would touch me on the shoulder and say, "Now then, young man, you didn't come to sea to dream." The crew wholly stoned the decks, the cook swore in the galley as only a sea cook can swear. And the cabin boy, who had never been to sea before, said, "Is that New Zealand?" and pointed shoreward. As we rolled along, with all sails set, he stood on his head as soon as my back was turned, for I saw him in the glass of the saloon portholes. I knew how he felt. I returned to England on the same ship, and then got a berth on the Seneca and went to America. A few years later, and I was again in Australia on the P&O liner Britannia. A strike was on, and we lay out in Sydney Harbour for 2 weeks and used to go ashore in a tender every evening. One night, I went ashore and played at a private concert out at Potts Point and stayed the night as well. It was a wedding festival, and my host and hostess were kind, bohemian folk, relations of Sir Henry Parkes. I cannot remember their name. They used their influence and secured me a position to play at the Government House balls in Sydney. I did so well that I got my box off my ship and left. At Government House I played as a solo, my own composition, The Monk's Dream, which I had arranged for violin and pianoforte, and A Soldier's Dream Waltz with variations. Among the audience was the present Lieutenant James Ord Hume, who was on a tour through Australia as adjudicator for the great military and brass band contests of Australia and New Zealand. Hearing me play, and finding that the solo was my own composition, he complimented me, and asked me to go to see him at the Occidental Hotel. I had a very good time there, for he was most hospitable. He was then about to leave Sydney for Ballarat. "Would you like to come on a trip with us?" he said. "Certainly," I answered, for I had a considerable amount of money just then and felt that a holiday would do me good. Mr. Hume had not been to Ballarat before and was delighted with the scenery passing over the Blue Mountains. In Ballarat we had various experiences, and I worked, digging for gold, down the chief gold mine, the Warhoop mine. We went outside the town and got into the bush too. For though Ballarat is a beautiful town, with splendid buildings, one can walk in a very short time right into the bush and see scenery equal to the Queensland landscape. The botanical gardens are also very beautiful and reveal patches of primeval Australia. We took snapshots of the Wendowie lakelet. Because of the pretty little plump colonial girls standing by the banks, they were nut brown with the sun. Mr. Ord Hume went out to see a friend who lived in the bush, but we only stayed 2 nights. There was a stable and swamp near our bedroom window, and when, after enjoying the squatters' hospitality and a musical evening, we went to bed, though we rubbed ourselves with kerosene oil and smoked, the mosquitoes charged down on our feet and faces in Hunnish regiments. At midnight we called our host, and he came to our door in his nightshirt and told us to rub some whiskey on our faces and on our feet, and gave us a full bottle of the best brand. Directly he had gone, we closed the door, wiped the sweat from our perspiring brows, and drew the cork to rub our ravaged bodies. "Don't you think, if we took the stuff internally and then smoked, that our breath full of the fumes would keep the cursed mosquitoes off?" I suggested. Mr. Hume quite agreed with my suggestion, which eventually turned out to be a most disastrous one for the mosquitoes, for we drank the whole bottle and then went to sleep, and never felt one mosquito bite the night through, nor did we wake till long after sunrise. I think it was for days before the great band contest, which Mr. Ord Hume was in Ballarat to adjudicate on, came off. The whole of Ballarat came to it. It was at that contest that I first became enthusiastic over bands. I felt the fire and go in the Australians' performances. Their bands cannot be beaten the world over. We saw a good deal of life in Australia together before I left Lieutenant J. Ord Hume, a few weeks after the Ballarat concert, arranging to see him later in New Zealand, where he was going to adjudicate at other band contests. I went as a passenger on a boat to New Zealand, and when I had been a few days in Auckland, I saw by the newspapers that Mr. Hume had arrived to judge the great New Zealand band competitions at Masterton and elsewhere. I managed to be there. The weather was glorious, also the applause of the New Zealanders as the bands marched by. I traveled with Mr. Hume by train over the Rimnatuka mountain from Wellington to Masterton. It took 3 engines to take the train over the rocky ledges and slopes. The grade is 1 in 15 in many places. The bushland and mountain scenery is equal to anything in Australia, for the scenery of New Zealand is wildly magnificent. After Mr. Ord Hume had judged and conducted the massed band performances at Auckland, he kindly invited me to join him, and we went off sightseeing, visiting bushlands, rivers, and hot springs, old tribal battle spots, and Maoris in their paws. Maori guides led us up mountains and across volcanic chasms and took a great deal of trouble on our behalf. They knew that Mr. Ord Hume had specially come across the world to judge the bands, and so they took us everywhere as their guests. Things had altered a good deal since my New Zealand visit of a year or so before. We went across the bush on the way to Wanganui's river and passed through thick, jungle-like forest and scenery that made us forget the world behind. I remember we came across one Maori pa where we got the Maoris to stand and have their photographs taken. I played the violin again as the thick-haired Maori girls chanted and danced. They have many kinds of dances, and the rhythmical movement of their bodies is equal to the weird beauty of the South Sea Island Siva dances. Some of the Maori girls are exceedingly handsome, but they fade at an early age. I remember one girl who was both handsome and intellectual looking. Her features were delicate and soft, refined through not being too perfect. She had a clear voice, and I extemporized an obligato on my violin as she sang in the pa. The chiefs and women were enthusiastic in their applause. One ancient chief was thickly tattooed in engraved, ornamental lines and looked exceedingly majestic. He spoke English perfectly, and I was deeply interested in the many things he told us of his younger days. He was a prince by blood and, like the old chief whom I told you of in a preceding chapter, remembered the days when the rival tribes met in battle, or his tribe resented the white man's encroachment on the tribal lands. I visited North and South Island and saw many of the geysers. Waimana Geyser is often in eruption and throws up volcanic steam and matter 900 feet and then quiets down. I tramped along in tourist fashion with my gay companion, helped take snapshots, and spoiled a good many. We saw, too, the Waimango Basin, the hot springs, and the Devil's Frying Pan, where one could stand up to one's ankles in fire. We stopped with a guide called Warwick and had a fine time. From there we traveled everywhere and camped out for several nights, just for the romance and fun of it. We cooked our potatoes and boiled eggs in the hot springs of the Karen Geyser, Rotorua. After that I secured a position as violinist in an orchestra at Auckland and bade Mr. Ordhume goodbye, for soon after he left New Zealand. I will now return once more to my old bohemian days. Away from respectability that whitewashes men, back away from the mighty orchestra of moving cogs and wheels, and from the crowds of cold eyes, thirsting for the gold which is necessary to keep them warm in white-collared respectability, back over the seas to the forests of Maori land, to the cry of the curlew and huia in the trees, by the old paws of Arakan, where Harawira, the old-time warrior, sat by the rushing river waters. His tattooed, engraved face is alive with memories. Once again, he tells me of the mighty Rui Maniapoto and the esprit de corps that bound the tribes together in their fierce battles when Maoris fought as bravely for their rights as the old Britons still do. Still I fancy I hear pretty Riworo, the Maori maid, singing her chant as she listens to the old chief's reminiscences of mighty deeds and battles of yore. In the birch and eucalyptus trees sigh old wines, and from the mysterious gloom of moonlit Arcadia come soft, weird sounds of Maori musical instruments. I could write chapters about the Maoris and their habits, and their wonderful poetic legends of dead chiefs singing in the forest, and maidens made of seafoam brightly dancing in the glimpsing moonlight of forest rivers. I have seen Maoris stare down the main streets of Masterton and swear that they could see the rivers rushing along in the moonlight and the canoes bearing the tribes over the swirling falls, while Maori maids, with their beautiful hair lifting in the winds, danced on ghostly, primeval waters. I have felt as they feel when they see the city spires rising over their enchanted lands, for I can dream as they dream and awake to the same reality. Were I to rise, as a man in a dream, and go back across the years and pitch my tent on the old spot in Queensland where I camped, I should be moved on for obstructing the tramcars. And yet, I am still a young man, so you will see how great is the change in a few years. I remember my self-made hut home, fashioned by my own hands, my comrade pulling the thick bush grass and boughs for the walls. How happy we were in that little room as the river sang, traveling onward. Just below we picked the ripe yellow oranges from the deep grass under the scented trees, where often my parrot raced me across the slope and flew by me sideways with its cut wing and won the race as I let it pass. I remember how, before the parrot died, it walked up our cabin wall screaming, with its tongue hanging from its beak. How great was my grief as its tiny jewel eyes opened and closed for the last time. That death was the great sorrow of our hut life, and we buried the poor bird, as parents do a beloved child, by the riverside. We went that same night over the slopes to the camp of Aborigines, who cheered us up as they danced the corroboree, while I played the fiddle under the moonlit gums. The old women were as black as ebony, and they also jumped and beat their hands on their skinny thighs, while old and young men, almost naked, whirled round the smoldering campfire, with their ribs painted white, looking like hideous, screaming skeletons. We gave them cakes of plug tobacco, and in return they would dance. Sometimes they would just begin, and then stop and say, "Me no dance, want more baccy first." I used to answer, "You no dance." Then me no play music, then their thick lips would flop together, as they all grinned, and off they would start, whirling round in the old brown government blankets which they wore over their shoulders, something after the cavalier fashion of romantic ages. One old fellow had a tremendous head, and was the tribal musician. He played a bone flute, the thigh bone of some ancestor. He blew for notes on it, and played them repeatedly. And the dusky forms chanted, and jumped round him, beating their black breasts with their hands. This is how the thigh bone wailed to the lips of its posterity. Those wild black men had creeds and poetic legends of their bush world, much the same as the wild white men. For some historic ancestors deed with the boomerang filthy old men and women were waited on by the low-caste tribe, who gazed upon their aboriginal gentry with awestruck eyes, and pushed hot, cooked white grubs and eel-like snakes into the big black lips of the aristocrats, who sat by the campfire and opened their huge mouths in a listless way, their black, protruding bellies heaving in the bloated affluence of their high lineage. I am a rolling stone, stern-fashioned in the mold, wherein God recast sand and bone. I glitter with pure gold, his workmanship, of course, not mine. So still I roll along, a sad old stone, half gem divine, gathering moss and song. God made me, yet I am weak throughout. I feel this as I roll by deep wild waters knocked about. But like my friend the mole, hid 'neath the earth and flowers, I peep up through a crack and spy another world. From darkness deep, I see a great blue sky. So on I'll roll and roll, until, on some wild torrent's leap, I fall into the mighty mill, sink in the ocean's deep, to lie quite still as ages fly, 'neath stars up o'er the main, till, brought up by the diver, I go rolling on again. From those wild bushlands, I passed away into the cities and on 2 ships, then again back to the cities and seaports of the world. I have often thought of the old crews that I sailed with as a boy. I've met them sometimes in grog saloons and sailors' homes in seaport towns of faraway countries. Only some of them, though, for many went down to the sea in ships and never returned. I have stood alone at night in the far-off seaport's little street and heard the drunken laughter of sailormen by their ships at the wharves below as I gazed into the windows of the second-hand slop shop at the Relics. Old binoculars, compasses, oilskin caps, and big sea boots hanging on pegs, in rows, for sale. As I looked, a mist crept under the rotting rafters of the dingy, musty, oil-lit room. The old oilskin swelled, and bearded wraiths of dead sailors danced. The big sea boots tumbled about in a jig by the broken window as I watched, and sounds of long-dead laughter echoed in my ears. Then up the little seaport street, from the bay, came a gust of wind and blew me into the forecastle of a ship far away at sea. I played the fiddle to the dancing dead men and climbed aloft as their hollow voices shouted a muffled, windy shanty. The old skipper, with his hand arched beneath his oilskin sou'wester, looked up aloft and shouted, and we all echoed back, "Aye, sir," and my comrade touched me on the shoulder and said, "Come on, Middleton, you don't want to buy any of those deedy old oilskins." Once more I found myself off, homeward bound round the Horn, crashing and rolling along, the howling sails aloft singing to the humming whines that we loved to hear. For the harder they blew, the sooner we should be in England. When I arrived in London, the autumn rains were falling, and the population of the mighty city of pavements and stone walls moved along under a myriad umbrellas. As old St. Paul's at flying intervals voiced forth from its mellow, iron throat the flight of time, some musical friends in the city had suggested to me that I should do a wise thing if I went to the fashionable winter resorts in France. The idea struck me as a very good one. I was told that instrumental players had gone to France, Spain, and Italy and come back wealthy. I had seen a good deal of the world at its outposts and had not succeeded in making even a portion of a fortune, so I resolved to get out of England without delay. Before I went, I felt that I must have a comrade. The thought of old age, with its boon companion, decrepitude, had always filled me with a strange horror, as something worse than death, and so for old age I always felt a commiseration and tenderness, which gave me confidence in gray hairs, which often got me into trouble, but more often brought advice and sensible comradeship. When in London, a year or so before, I had made friends with a gentleman whose name was Bonnevard. He had been educated in France, was a clever man, and could speak French, Spanish, and Italian. It struck me that if I could find out his whereabouts, I might persuade him to come with me, for he was a jovial man, and his knowledge of French would help me in my travels. To tell you the truth, too, I was rather short of money, and thought perhaps he might even lend me a little towards the expenses of the trip. I was getting older, and experience had taught me that too much money was not so inconvenient as too little. I went off to his villa in the suburbs. The old place had to let in the window. No one in the district knew of his whereabouts, but at last, just as I was almost disheartened and giving up the thought of finding him, I met a gentleman who had known him. He at once gave me his address in Nate, Homerton Workhouse, Hackney. I was very much upset. I knew too well what trials, insults, and sufferings my friend must have experienced before he sought a haven of rest in that terrible inquisition, the English workhouse. I went to Homerton. The officials treated me most politely. Directly, they discovered the reason of my visit. When I told my old comrade I wanted to take him to France as my guest and interpreter, I was considerably affected by his delight. He had aged since I had last seen him. The old stiff military mustachios had turned white and had lost their aristocratic, upward twirls. Next day they were once more alert and alive with renewed majesty, and the handsome old face, though deeply wrinkled, was boyish-looking with delight. He was a new being in his frock coat and tall hat, which I purchased remarkably cheaply at a pawnbroker's shop. The gloss of his hat was perfection, and as he smoothed it with his sleeve, in the old way, he laughed almost hysterically, with a schoolboy's laughter, but my ear detected the wizened, high note of age in it, and it made him more pathetic than ever. The next day, with his dead wife's photograph and his traveling kit in my box, as steerage passengers we went down the Thames together, both happy, on board the S.S. Albatross, bound for Bordeaux. Arriving at Bordeaux, we found it advisable, owing to the state of our exchequer, to live outside in the suburbs, so we rented a pretty little chateau in the Rue Cotteron. The weather was bitterly cold, and we spent a good portion of the day in trying to make our coke fire burn. Every night we walked into Bordeaux and got a good feed in a restaurant. 1 franc 50 centimes secured us several courses, with a bottle of wine each included. I wandered about Bordeaux a good deal, and went down the leafy pathways of the botanical gardens, but could not appreciate anything owing to the cold wines. I had thought to visit spots associated with the old French philosopher, Montaigne, who doubtless in his day wandered over the historic streets, where I now walked looking for violin engagements. In my sea chest at our chateau I had Montaigne's essays, and I satisfied myself by lying in my bed and reading the deep, innocent wisdom of the great Frenchman. Near where we lived, there was a wine merchant and many residents who, I think, worked in the vineyards. From the merchant we got credit, and things eventually became so bad that we lived for some time on wine and haricot beans. At last I secured a course of concert engagements at English and French clubs and concerts. My comrade and I invited the wine seller and several Frenchmen to supper every night, and the little chateau with Zienglais gentlemen in it rang with song as a French harp player, and I played. Long after midnight the noise went on. They all lifted their arms and opened their mouths, while Mr. Bonnevard told those chivalrous Frenchmen of his experiences in the siege of Paris. They were delighted with my comrade's yarns, and he went on spinning them vigorously. I could not speak French, so I could only watch their faces expressing horror or surprise as he fired away. About 2 weeks later, the smash came. The rent of the chateau was 100 francs a month and was due. We also owed the wine seller for about 100 bottles of red and white wine. It was cheap enough, 4 a litre. We could not possibly pay the rent, but we held a hurried and private council and resolved to give our friend the wine seller 50 francs and send the remainder after we arrived at Biarritz. We dared not give him more, otherwise we should not have our fare. We intended sending the rent to the agent, who was a little Frenchman and lived round the corner, directly we had some luck, and we did do so. Before we went away, we invited them all to a grand supper, which ended at midnight with the stirring Marseillaise. We had to be at the Midi station by 10 o'clock next morning. The cab arrived. We first went to the agent to tell him we were obliged to leave for the English season at Biarritz and would send the rent on, but he was out, so off we drove. We had no sooner turned the corner of the street than the agent passed us in a small chaise and spied us and our boxes. About 5 minutes after, we saw him chasing after us, about a quarter of a mile behind, shouting at the top of his voice. "Hadn't we better stop and explain?" I said to my companion. But he would not do so. A whole regiment of gendarmes with drawn swords behind us would not have disturbed him, but would have simply supplied more excitement to the splendor of his La Belle France. He compared everything that happened around him to his life in the Homerton workhouse, and so rubbed his hands with delight, and shouted in French to the driver, who at once whipped up the horse, and away we rumbled at full speed. I painfully felt that we were not in the South Seas, and began to feel uncomfortable when I noticed that the little agent was gaining upon us. I had come to France to make my fortune, and the prospect did not appear much better than it did when I was seeking wealth in the Australian goldfields a few years before. I stood up and shouted to Franksmore in the driver's ear, He seemed to understand and gave the poor horse another slash, and as we flew by, the French people rushed from their villas and shops, thinking a fire engine was passing through the maze of Bordeaux streets. We eventually lost sight of the agent, caught the train, and arrived in due course at Biarritz. In Biarritz I did well, played at the casino, and gave private concerts at the different clubs and hotels where the wealthy English visitors stayed: the Hôtel de Paris, Hôtel d'Angleterre, and Hôtel du Prince. The British residents consisted of titled folk, high chiefs, princes, and princesses, descendants of old tribes of blue-blooded lineage. My comrade was worth his weight in gold. His engaging manner enabled him to take liberties with old colonels and the austere English set, which would have been strongly resented if perpetrated by anyone else. I saw aristocratic old gentlemen flush and clutch their falling eyeglass with astonishment as he smacked them on the back, but they recovered and were amused by his manner. For his appearance and address revealed a personality and intellectual quality equal to their own. We also went to Bayonne, an old-fashioned city surrounded by crumbling ramparts. They had a splendid military band there and played brilliantly. My companion was so delighted with the change in his affairs that he sang my songs and no one else's as he walked and hummed by my side. Before we left Biarritz, we stayed for a week at the Hotel St. Julien. Mr. Morrison, who ran it, gave a farewell concert on our behalf and refused to accept anything for our stay in his hotel. My comrade loved singing, but had no voice for expressing the love. Mrs. Morrison heroically presided at the piano as he sang, over and over again, the one song which he sang other than my compositions. It was the heart bowed down with weight of woe. Mr. Morrison would clench his teeth and drink a stiff glass of cognac, and then, as the old fellow bowed in a courtly way, encore him. Our host was a clever literary man and had all the kindness and sincerity of a true bohemian gentleman. My old friend and I were sorry to bid him and his kind wife goodbye. They made us up a hamper of savory food and told us to write to them if we ever got into a tight corner. With about 500 francs in our possession, we crossed the Pyrenees, and after a month's traveling, playing at various concerts and Spanish festivals, we arrived at Madrid. We secured apartments in the old Moorish quarter, then sallied forth and mingled with the swarthy population. The avenues and parks were alive with youths and beautiful dark girls with Arab eyes and glorious dark or bronze hair. Groups of roistering men stood about smoking cigarettes. They looked like a mixture of Italian, Moor, Turk and Arab, so reminiscent were they of those races. We wandered by the Puerta del Sol and in the crowded streets nearby, and aristocratic, sharp-bearded hidalgos with large-brimmed sombreros on the heads and cloaks thrown over their shoulders passed us like cavaliers of the medieval ages. Till I became used to the scene round me, I felt that we walked the streets of some old, lost city. That the sailors of the Spanish Armada still had lovers among the Spanish beauties who sang in groups as they passed us, wearing short, ornamental skirts and colored kerchiefs, loosely swathing their heads of thick dark hair. The Spaniards gazed over their mantled shoulders with admiring eyes, and the laughing, flattered Spanish maidens reciprocated their gallant attention by gazing back with amorous eyes at their handsome figures, with black velvet breeches, slashed at the sides to reveal pink drawers and frills. The faya sashes of the men vied in vividness of color with the gay swathing of the fair, bronzed maids. We strolled on the banks of the Manzanares River by moonlight and seemed to walk through fairyland, though by day hundreds of Spanish women used the river as a washing tub. And forests of clothes props and stretched lines blossomed forth with delicate and beautiful undergarments of silk material. The Hidalgo's velvet breeches and the maids' fayas fluttered cheerfully side by side in the wines among the chestnut groves, and often the cavaliers and dark-eyed maids that owned them lay tucked in bed till the laundress brought them home, so poor were they. My comrade could speak Spanish fairly well, and kept excitedly telling me so many things that I remembered none of them. In the cheap quarter of the town, where touring violinists and poets generally reside, mysterious smells of garlic and cooking steams killed the romance that hovered about the beautiful terraced architecture of Madrid. I looked in vain for a position as violinist, but it was not to be had, or the salary was only sufficient to enable one to live on garlic. So I was forced to become a Spanish troubadour and go off serenading affluent hidalgos. Fortunately, I very soon replenished our dwindling exchequer. My comrade, having been educated in France, could bow as royally as the Spanish señors, and conducted all the financial part of the business. We went into partnership with our landlady's daughters, who played the guitar and mandolin, and I conducted the troupe. When the festival carnivals began a week later, we had a glorious time and made enough money to enable us to live comfortably. I played my Samoan waltz, arranging it for 2 violins, guitar and mandolins, and the wild barbarian note of the strain was very popular. Maidens, who looked like Arab girls with shining eyes, whirled and swayed in the arms of their Don Juans, as under the Spanish moon my cheerful troupe tinkled away, and I played the violin. Except for their artistic gowns and the sashes flapping as they danced, I saw the South Sea Islanders dancing before me. The same abandonment was there. Their musical voices, as they sang the refrain, brought back to me wild tribal dances of the South Sea forest, where a few years before I had conducted the banging war drums and wedding music for cannibals, high chiefs, dethroned kings, and discarded queens. Pretty Mercedes and Mary, her sister, sang minor melodies in duet style as I extemporized an obligato on my violin. They then danced the Jota Aragonesa and other dances, and little children romped about and imitated bullfights, singing wildly all the time. After the carnival was over, my comrade and I strolled about the sleeping city and visited the old quarter of alleyways and gloomy buildings and hidden dens where suspicious characters met and loose lovers played guitars and mandolins. We watched old priests shuffling along to visit the 6 señors who had fed on garlic and walnuts and lived in Madrid's East End, but dressed in the blue. Open days in majestic splendor and vivid color. We went to the many temples of Madrid. They are seldom silent, for up their aisles creep gentle Spanish girls who come in, cross themselves and kneel in prayer to Jesus and the Holy Virgin. The earnestness of it all would soften the hardest cynic. Old priests abound and revel in the confessions of those innocent girls as they bow their heads with shame and confess that they have thought more during the week of Don Juan's stalwart, lithe figure than of the Holy Virgin. As they pass, one sees them crossing themselves and murmuring their prayers. At the doors, wrinkled old women pester one with little boxes of wax matches, walnuts, and photographs of Madrid and the Blessed Virgin. If one buys a cent's worth of anything from them, they follow on for 300 yards, calling down the blessing of God, Jesus, and the Virgin on one's head. At night time, when the moon is high and the olive trees and palms are windless and still, down the white terraced avenue goes Don Quixote astride his ass, twirling his mustachios, till far away, with Sancho Panza by his side, he fades under the moonlit chestnut groves. From the forests of alleyways steal appealing figures, with eyes that beg for an admiring glance, and in strange, soft tones wail of sorrows and no food or place to lay their weary heads. Give them a coin and pass on. They cross themselves and mention the Holy Virgin's name, and you realize there is something wrong with the world, for the cry of the Virgin's name sounds sincere. All the cities have that frail woman begging the world to be her husband, because she never secured one good man to love her and rear those bonny boys and girls who wail to be born in the infinite shadows behind her. It is a sorrow that has even spread across the world and reached the island tribes of the South Seas. Standing on the garden roof of our house in Madrid, we could see the country round, a barren country, and looking like the Australian Never Never Land in a civilized state. It is dotted with dusty tracks and old isolated inns. Herds of goats and mules fade far across the tracks, looking like droves of rats in the desert distance. There are beautiful spots in Madrid, on the banks of the Manzanares, and firs, beeches, and chestnuts shade the waters and the slopes by the royal gardens. At night, I used to lie in my attic room and listen to the nightingales singing in the chestnut tree outside my window, its mate piping back approval from another tree at regular intervals. My old comrade lay fast asleep on the next trestle bed, for the Spanish hidalgos gave him cognac, and on the way home from the festival concerts, he would clutch me tightly by the arm, as little Mercedes and Mary laughed by my side. In the morning, he used to say, "Dear boy, whatever was it that overcame me last night? It's that wretched garlic." Sometimes when we were short of money, we lay on our bed smoking, and he would tell me of the siege of Paris, his terrible experiences there, and how he ate his share of the elephant and lion steaks from the zoo. Becoming philosophical, he would tell me of his boyish aspirations, the happiness he got out of them, and the worrying from the events that never happened. I would say, supposing we run right out of money, what about food and a bed? Then he would cheer me up by saying, "My dear boy, all's sure to be well. We are certain to be somewhere and sleep somewhere whatever happens. Then, as was his wont, he would lick his thumb and push the old cigar stump into his pipe and hum my last melody, a melody that no publisher would buy, till I, secure in his philosophical comradeship, fell asleep. He never professed or spoke on religious matters, but each night he knelt by his bed before he got in and lit his pipe. We were very happy in the house of Senora Dolores. She treated us as though we were dear relatives. In her little attic room, I spent the happiest hours of my continental travels. I lay half the night reading my beloved Montaigne's essays. The old French Shakespeare was my best dead learned friend. If ever I was worried and could not sleep for thinking, I went to my sea chest and brought him out. I read some of his essays over 20 times, but they were always fresh, wise, and sincere, and I still read them. In that little room I also read poetry's legitimate child, Keats. As my dear comrade slept on, I fell in love with Madeline and roamed with Endymion, Lamia, and Hyperion. The nightingale singing outside. Charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. As the moonlight glimmered through my little room, I have read somewhere that Keats was earthly. I think if he had lived, his intense genius would have fought for the sorrows of humanity, and his marvelous mind made literature and our country even better than it is. It may be centuries before Earth, capable of bringing forth such spiritual flowers as his earthliness did, will be born again. Poor little Mercedes! She crossed herself and murmured the Holy Virgin's name many times as we bade her and her sister goodbye, and I thought of Madeline and felt sad that the days of gallant knights and amorous warriors were gone forever. I can still see their eyes shining through sorrow as we said farewell. Even the old mother's wrinkled face blushed as we kissed the three. We went from Madrid to Valencia, where we stayed for 3 weeks, and then left by boat for Marseilles, and then on to Nice, and finally to Genoa. My comrade was the happiest of men as he tramped beside me. He loved to carry my violin. We started to write an opera together, entitled The Siege of Paris. He was delighted as he gave me thrilling, realistic details of all he had witnessed. I tried to place them in lyrical form and wrote suitable melodies round the tragic events. He knew as much about authorship as I did, but I believe, with the help of his clever head and earnestness, we should have amply made up for our artistic deficiencies and lack of literary method. The manuscript still remains unfinished, as we left it, for not long after he ceased singing my songs. The brief sunlight between the workhouse and the grave faded and disappeared. When I turned away from his last resting place, I was the only mourner, and as I went away into our mysterious world, once more I felt very lonely. So end the intimate reminiscences of my wanderings, most of them experiences up to my 22nd birthday. Whether I have succeeded in giving the reader an insight into the personality of the writer, such a glimpse as an autobiography is supposed to give, I do not know. Personally, I think it is a hard thing to do in a thorough sense, especially for a vagabond at heart. Each individual is a multitude of struggling ancestral strains, and real active life is manifested in the fight, the fierce hunt to find ourselves, which we can never do, for we die every moment that we live. So all we can attempt in a book is to tell truthfully those things that impressed us deeply at different periods of our life, so deeply that they still remain imprinted on the mind. Also to tell of our experiences for better or worse in this life of ours, where one footstep taken out of the track that we have known and write about would have altered the whole book of our life to another color. Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe to the channel to help the channel grow further. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.